Booz Allen is delivering mission-ready solutions, AI-powered, software-defined, and commercial-first. Combining deep mission experience with commercial partnerships, Booz Allen is defining a new defense industrial base, a network that crosses traditional boundaries to scale non-traditional technologies and brings our best tech to the hands of the warfighter faster, effectively delivering technology for today and tomorrow. Booz Allen, accelerating outcomes for today's warfighters.
Hello and welcome to the Emerging Tech Horizons podcast. I'm Arun Seraphin, Executive Director of NDAA's Emerging Technologies Institute. Today we're going to talk about the National Defense Authorization Act for 2026, the law that sets policy for the Department of Defense. It's fighting its way through both the House and the Senate as we speak. To talk about the details of the NDAA, how it's going to affect acquisition reform, how it's going to affect emerging technologies development, we're joined by repeat guest at the podcast, Moshe Schwartz, the president at Etherton and Associates. Hey, Moshe, thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me back.
Before we dive into the meat of these bills, and you've been helpful in the past to sort of talk us through NDAA processes, I can commend those old episodes to you to understand how an NDAA is built. I want to just ask you a couple of background questions to frame this. In the defense world, we are blessed to have both a defense appropriations law and an authorization law. Why do we have both of these laws? Why not just have one?
So first, I'm not sure DoD feels blessed by having both of them, but we have both of them. Absolutely. So the Authorization Act, as you just mentioned, what we're going to talk about today, hopefully, is the policy bill. And that is very different than the Authorization Act, which is really it's different than the Appropriations Act. That's the money. That's how much money do you get? And never the twain really should meet. You're not going to generally see policy questions in the Appropriations Act, and you're not really going to see appropriations or the actual giving of money in the Authorization Act.
And could you live in a world with only one or the other of those?
No. You can't live in a world with no appropriations because then you have no funding for the department. But you could live in a world, generally, that has appropriations but no authorization. In fact, many agencies do live with that. They don't get authorizations every single year. And one of the unique things about the National Defense Authorization Act is, as you know, it is passed for more than 60 years in a row. So other agencies, they get their authorization hitching a ride on the National Defense Authorization Act. Most notably, the Intel Authorization Act comes with defense.
So where are we currently in the authorization process?
So right before the August recess, the House and Senate Armed Services Committees both advanced their versions of the bill. So the House Armed Services Committee passed their version of the bill that will, after recess in August, go to the Rules Committee and then the floor, which is what you need to do to get a full House-passed version. And then the Senate Armed Services Committee advanced their version of the bill. And now we already have, I believe it's about 499 or 599 amendments that have been filed for the floor consideration when the Senate comes back and starts hopefully debating amendments for the Senate to pass its version. Once that's done, if the House passes their version and the Senate passes their version, then they get together and hash it out. And if passed is prologue, which it has been in recent years, we could expect a NDAA bill completed and ready to go and hopefully signed by the president sometime after Thanksgiving. So we're probably talking about the November, December timeframe, depending on how leadership wants to do things.
For a fiscal year that begins on October 1st?
Yes, because the fiscal year doesn't matter anymore. In fact, the last time an NDAA was passed before the end of the fiscal year was ironically the John McCain National Defense Authorization Act, which was quite a while ago.
Now, this is all happening just after we passed a budget reconciliation bill, which had elements of both an authorization bill and an appropriations bill to it.
Yeah, so if we want to get really confusing, this is the topic to talk about, right? So the reconciliation bill is not an appropriations. So just because the reconciliation was passed with about $150 billion for defense, we still have to pass an appropriations for the Defense Department for the next fiscal year. Think of the reconciliation as bonus. right? Or off-book money, as it were.
So now when I see what's going on in the two authorization bills, I hear echoes of the past. It's we're going to fix acquisition, we're going to make the department go faster, we're going to change the wiring diagram in this part of the department and change the wiring diagram in the other part of the department. And it kind of sounds all the same to me. So, Ma Nishtana, explain to me why this is any different than anything we've seen any other time.
So I actually think it is a little bit different. In many years, in fact, for many, many years, and we've talked about this in the past, there's a lot of tweaks. I would suggest these NDAAs, both in the House and Senate versions, are trying to go deeper and trying to solve some fundamental issues. And I will give you a couple of examples. So one is requirements, right? There's an attempt to really rethink and re-image the requirements process for the Department of Defense in both bills. So for example, in the House bill, there's section 1811 about the Joint Requirements Council. And what it does is it says the JROC, the Joint Requirements Council, well, now it's going to become advisory. It's not going to be the validator. That's a big change. And not only that, it goes a step further, and we see this throughout both bills. It says you have to strongly consider, it never said this before, combatant commander input. There's a pushing down to combatant commanders throughout the bills, more authority and input. And the Senate has the similar approach. It also says it becomes advisory. It also says that you have to coordinate with the combatant commanders. But then they go a step further. Both bills have provisions in it. In the House, it's section 1812. And in the Senate, it's 913. That says in the House version, you will set up a directorate that's chaired by the head of the Cost Analysis and Program Evaluation Group, the budget scrubbers, as it were, in DOD, and the JROC, the requirements guys, and they have to get together and figure this out. And the House says, do a study on how this would be done. Those are big changes on the budget scrub and the requirements scrub. That is one example of a fundamental change that we really haven't seen in prior years.
Yeah, we talked about going after the requirements process a lot. There have been attempts to go after it. Arguably, the middle tier of acquisition authority goes after the JSIDS process a little bit, the requirements process a little bit. There's been talk, and we actually had Bill Greenwald on as a podcast guest recently with some of his work on requirements, of disestablishing the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. Does anyone go that far?
So they don't disestablish it here. I mean, Bill would go that far, I'm guessing, right? But if you make it advisory, you're really changing the dynamics of the game. And again, this is an opening salvo. This is where they're going now. We'll see what happens. It's possible nothing happens, and then it's like past NDAs. But this is really an evolving change. And I don't think this year's NDAA, however it comes out, is going to be the end of it. I think this is a different world we're living in. Just like technology moves faster, I think this is going to be moving faster.
And did either the House or the Senate say what they hope to achieve by rewickering the requirements process?
So they put out there big conversations on what they hope to achieve, not just by this, but by a lot of the things we're going to talk about over the episode, which is speed. How do you get things done faster? And so part of the idea here is how do we speed up the requirements process, right? The other thing is integrating. How do you integrate the three legs of the stool of requirements and budget, which is what these are doing? We said the CAPE and the JROC together, and the acquisition process. And how do you put them together? Because they've been so, and I know this is surprising at DOD, stovepiped, right? So how do we bring them together? They are very clear. And then the other two things that they talk about, which you'll see now in the themes as we talk about specific provisions, is expanding the defense industrial base and speeding up development and deployment of technology as well.
Okay, so that might make this cycle different than any other cycle. But what other things are along those lines?
Another way is how you think about managing everything. So we have program executive officers, and they manage their programs, but they generally manage them individually. And what this bill is trying to do in, again, both the House and Senate versions, is create a portfolio management approach where you look across programs and you can move money around, you can change requirements around and do all those types of things, right? That's a big change also if, and here's the biggest
What's the relationship between the portfolio manager and the current program executive officer?
So you would change the name if it's in the Senate, or you would change the duties of it. So the change of the name is really to show the flavor of how we're changing things. You can change certain requirements, not the key performance parameters necessarily. It says that still has to go through a process, but they're lower level requirements, certain budgets, certain timing schedules, those they would have the authority to move around. So that's another big change of how you think about doing things in the department.
Right. And this gets written into law, but it sounds like if it gets written to a law and signed into law, then you have to reorganize the department then, right?
Yes. And I think you're touching on one of the biggest challenges of, I don't want to say acquisition reform, it's any reform in particularly the Department of Defense, but almost any government agency, which is Congress can say do something, but if DOD doesn't really buy into doing it, will it really get done the way it was envisioned? Because these are hard efforts. And I would argue from our understanding of history that no, there needs to be a partnership at least between DOD and Congress. But I think we're seeing one here in very unique ways.
Has anyone in the department asked for the portfolio acquisition executive approach?
So it has been talked about a lot. So for example, for those of you who recall some of the past episodes where we've talked about it, the 809 panel from a number of years ago on acquisition streamlining, they had a whole conversation on portfolio management. So there are definitely champions in the department and in the administration for this portfolio management approach. And parenthetically, we'll talk about commercial items and other transaction authorities. There are executive orders that are very similar or mirroring these same concepts.
Yeah, speaking of commercial, non-traditional, sort of allowing DoD to expand its industrial base and embrace commercial technologies, that's been a theme for at least the last decade. Lots of people wrote what they thought was lots of clever stuff, but you're saying we're doubling down on it again. So what are some of these examples of going after commercial, going after non-traditionals?
So there's a lot. So there was a study put out less than a month ago, I believe, by George Mason University that talked about non-traditional defense contractors and how more than 90% or roughly 90% of the companies in the defense industrial base actually meet that definition, because the definition is not what people think. People think, oh, you're a traditional defense contractor. That means you do a lot of work with DoD. No, the definition is over the last year, have you had a contract that has full cost accounting standard coverage? Or in other words, do you have for a contract that unique accounting standards just for DoD contracts that generally come along with cost contracts where you're being paid for your costs plus some sort of profit or fee that goes along with it?
And so the cost accounting standards are unique to the Department of Defense or unique to the federal government?
They are very unique to the Department of Defense. It's like keeping two books,
Okay.
Except in this case, they would both be legal books.
Right. So you're a traditional contractor if you've accepted a contract like that, not because you're particularly slow, that you're particularly good or not good at anything, you have clearances. That's not what makes you a traditional contractor. It's the fact that you accepted from your customer in the past this style of contract.
Right. In fact, you could be doing $10 billion of business a year with the Department of Defense for the past 20 years and be a non-traditional defense contractor,
Right.
Which some people think, well, that sounds a little bit odd. So the Senate version of the bill seeks to expand the definition of non-traditional defense contractors. And in essence, what it is saying is, even if you have one of these cost accounting standard contracts, under certain circumstances, you can still be considered a non-traditional. So it's expanding potentially the types of companies that could apply as non-traditional defense contractors.
And why does anyone want to do that?
So some people want to do that on the theory that we need to get certain types of companies into the defense industrial base, and we want to favor them. And we want to almost put our thumb on the scale and say, these are the companies we want to do business with. Now, on the other hand, other people will argue, well, is that really the approach we want to take? Shouldn't it be a level playing field? Do we really want to favor companies based on their corporate structure or the type of contracts they're taking? Or should we be awarding contracts based on the capability we're getting, and that should be the discriminator.
And the kinds of companies we're talking about are those cool robotics, software, AI companies, guys in hoodies, those kinds of things, right? Those are the companies that we want to work with the Department of Defense. Those are the ones we usually think of as non-traditional defense contractors.
So non-traditional defense contractors, really anyone who sells anything commercial. So it's not necessarily A, those hoodie companies, but B, arguably some of the technology that DoD gets now from traditional contractors is pretty exquisite. So to say the companies that have built the leading technological weapon systems of today, we probably still want to have them around because they are, in fact, putting out some of those gee whiz bang stuff also. So let's not create two tiers. Maybe we have to figure out a way, and it's not easy, of getting everybody to compete, and let's get the best stuff.
But if you are non-traditional, you will like this House version, House bill and Senate bill, because I think they do provide some advantages to the non-traditionals. Isn't that right?
Well, it does, but it depends. Depends what kind of non-traditional you are. So for example, there is a provision, it's section 824 in the Senate bill, that would say if you buy from a non-traditional, you must buy it as a commercial item or service, right? Even if it is built on military specifications, you have to buy it as commercial. Well, those companies that are selling today to the Department of Defense real commercial items and services may have a problem with that, because they may view that as undermining actually buying commercial, which is supposed to be a preference.
So just because you're a non-traditional, in theory, you could sell a nuclear missile to the Department of Defense and it could be considered a commercial item.
Yeah, pretty much. It also does a couple of other things. In this oversight world of certified cost and pricing data, and earned value management, there is a tug of war between industry and Congress and DoD, people taking different sides of what should be the thresholds. How much information should you have to give? But there's generally been an agreement that there should be some sort of visibility into certain things. If you look at some of the provisions like Senate 823, exemption for non-traditional defense contractors, it would exempt non-traditional defense contractors from earned value management, auditing of cost estimating systems, property management systems, cost principles.
These are all systems that were probably overwritten at the time, but designed to help the government understand what it was buying and the prices it was paying?
And how reliable are some of the systems so you can rely on systems, and are they meeting standards for government? Yeah, basically it's the idea of oversight. Now, arguably there's maybe a little bit too much oversight sometimes, but if you're taking off some of these requirements for some, should you be taking it off for all? Or to put it on a finer note, some people would argue one of the reasons why perhaps traditional companies aren't as innovative as people would expect is because they have to adhere to these. So if you're not going to apply these to non-traditionals, why apply them to traditionals? Or vice versa, if you can apply them to traditionals for oversight reasons, why not apply them to the non-traditionals?
What's the typical answer to that question?
I'm still trying to figure that out.
Okay, what if I said, well, these companies that I call non-traditionals are bringing much more skin into the game, right? Their own money, venture money, private equity money, and therefore they deserve some advantage because they are contributing more to the development of these items than a traditional contractor who largely is living off of government contracts. Is there anything to that?
So I think there are a couple of interesting points that you're raising. The first one is, so if companies are investing, but on some level, then it should be based on that particular product, not the entire company. Okay? So let's look at that product and make it on a product by product decision, who's bringing the money or not.
Right. So you're describing more like an easy pass system, right? You can pay and go in this fast lane, or you cannot pay and stay in the other.
That's one possibility, but another possibility is sometimes DoD knows what it wants. And if it wants something, that comes with certain ways of doing things. And do you want to exclude or not exclude? But it will be a long conversation, probably over many years, to figure out the balance here. But the last thing I would say is, if you look at the evolution of non-traditional defense contractors, much of it was for the purpose of bringing companies into the defense industrial base. So just like small business, you want small businesses, but at some point they grow to a certain size, there's an off-ramp. Should there be an off-ramp for non-traditional defense contractors? Because on some level, at the point that you're doing $500 million or $1 billion or $2 billion of business a year with the Department of Defense, in what world are you not a traditional defense contractor?
Right. It goes back to that definition being limited to the kinds of contracts you take. Right. So both bills also go at the sort of the guts of how the acquisition system deals with soliciting commercial services and emerging commercial technologies and how it contracts for them. What are some of the attempts that they try to reform the system along those lines?
So the Senate bill has this provision that totally turns commercial buying on its head. Right? Where currently, if you want to buy something commercial, you have to do a commercial determination to see if it meets the standards of, is it offered for sale or sold? This would totally switch that and say, if you want to buy something non-commercial, you have to do a determination of non-availability in the commercial markets and get it signed off on, basically.
Right. Now, how is that different than the current law that was written in the mid-90s?
Right, because the current law has a presumption, ultimately, that something is non-commercial, and you have to do a determination that it is commercial. This comes with the assumption that everything is commercial, and if you want to buy something that's not commercial, you have to do a determination that you can't get it commercial. It's a completely different view of things, which also interplays with non-traditional, but we can get into that another time. But the bill also goes further. It's not just about commercial, right? It's also about technology and rapid and evolving capability. So for example, Section 826 of the Senate bill would modify commercial solution openings, removing the requirement for it to be innovative, for example. If it's just commercial, that's good. It doesn't have to be innovative, and allowing it to be used for non-developmental items.
Yeah, because this was really a science and research-oriented authority before, and now, in theory, you're opening it up to services, right?
And you're not only opening up to that, you're allowing follow-on production like adding OTs, right? So it's really mirroring that and opening the aperture, as it were. There's a modification for OTAs, for non-competitive contracts, or emergent and proven technologies that do not require additional development. So you're opening the aperture of OTAs, and not just opening the aperture, but trying to make it more rapid by minimizing the approval requirements that you need for different levels.
So again, moving it just out of the science and technology research world, much more into the broader acquisition community. Get a more useful tool for the rest of the acquisition community.
Correct. But then it also does focus more on some of the developmental stuff in acquisition. So for example, in the Senate, Section 828, it modifies procurement for experimental purposes. So that is an authority that arguably is underutilized in the department. So this is trying to expand that authority for demonstrations, for prototypes, for auxiliary services. That's a bigger aperture than what you currently have the authority to do.
So a lot of these Senate provisions came out of something called the Forge Act. What happened to the Forge Act?
So the Forge Act was basically rolled into the Senate bill with obviously modifications and changes.
So we shouldn't be tracking that anymore. Now everything's in the Senate NDAA.
Absolutely.
Similarly, there was a bill on the House side called the Speed Act, kind of their version of the Forge Act. What happened to that?
So that was rolled into Title 18 of the House version of the NDAA. So I think what we're going to get at the end of the day is an NDAA called Forged at Speed.
I hope not.
But some of the things that we're talking about there, I don't want to leave the impression that it's just in the Senate bill. So for example, the OTAs that we're talking about, streamlining that's also in Section 1831 of the House bill. So many of these have correlations to the House bill as well. There's also one on consumption-based solutions, Section 829. So anything that is metered, right, that is usable and standard, there's language on that authority as well to expand that authority.
But we've always talked about, well, gee, why is DOD good at buying electricity, water, food, things that everyone buys, or some things that are metered, And why can't they buy drones and things like that way? And so I guess we're creeping in that direction a little bit.
We definitely are creeping in that direction, but also we're also potentially rethinking how do we view value, right? We talked about certified cost and pricing data a little bit. So the House has language that I think more mirrors how we do things in our normal lives. It's section 1823, alternative capability-based pricing, which is a mouthful. But basically what it's saying is when you're determining what's reasonable, look at the capability. Is it worth it to you? Don't look at the cost and the profit, but look at the value. Is it suitable? Does it give you the capabilities that you want? Are you avoiding other costs by doing it?
Yeah, that's interesting because then that ties back to the requirements discussion. We did a podcast on warfighter portable drones where the complaint was the requirements are nice and that drives the budget and the acquisition process. But it's the capability that matters, and often the requirement doesn't create something that's a capability that really matters. And so if this gets at the point of understanding the capability you need, and then you can acquire based on that capability, that's an interesting twist.
So I would argue it goes even further than that. If we really want to drive innovation, we really want to drive investment, right? Not just with venture capital, not just with private equity, but companies putting their own skin in the game. How many companies are going to say, I'm going to do a $500 million bet for a 15% profit off a certified cost and pricing data? Not many. That's what drives a lot of companies to go for the government-funded R&D. But if you say to them, look, we'll value what you're selling us off of the value to the department. So if we're spending $1 billion for a capability and you can invest and charge us $700 for the same capability, we don't care what your profit is. Well, that is your incentive. And we should want all companies to want to jump after that, not just, I would argue, a certain type of company, be it a non-traditional or venture capital backed or equity backed. Let's put everybody to invest money if they could get the value of it.
So on top of this theme of going as far forward as we can in adopting commercial buying practices, expanding the industrial base to include more commercial companies, buying more commercial technologies and services, there's also the drumbeat of we need to go faster, right? There's this efforts to reform, to create speed. And I take it both bills are going after speed as well.
Yeah, so some of the provisions we talked about are definitely about speed. And let me give you some of the examples. Other transaction authorities. Technically, they're not necessarily faster, but practically they very often are. Commercial solution openings, definitely. Experimental authorities, for sure. All of the JROC requirements process, a lot of that is about the speed. So if you look at the details of the House bill, they're saying you have to do certain requirement steps in time certain increments. It's absolutely going about speed, but it's not only speed that they're going after. They're trying to make the system cleaner and easier to navigate and frankly less daunting. So you can find authorities, you can find laws, and you're not overwhelmed. And they're doing that by repealing a lot of provisions, right? So the Senate has Section 868, which repeals a slew of statutes, dozens of statutes and dozens. Although if it's in the 75 to 90 range, just to give you a sense, the Forged Act was closer to 300 provisions they were proposing for repeal. This definitely cuts back on that.
Well, I mean, I understand the difficulty in repealing things. During my time on the Hill, and you were helping me with this, we every year tried to repeal certainly reporting requirements, but old law that we thought no one was using. It gets really hard to repeal old law and have an impact on anyone. So give me an example. How is this repeal actually going to affect the lives of any NDAA member?
So I'll tell you where I think it makes a difference. I'm not sure it really would matter in the individual things being repealed because most of those are things that really aren't used anymore. Where it makes a difference is it declutters the laws and regulations. So it takes things off the books. So what it means is when you're trying to find something, it's easier to find it. Like when you clean the room before you start figuring out what you want to keep, it's very useful to see what you've got. I'll tell you the story. Once I was talking to somebody at DOD, I won't mention who who was the expert in a certain topic. But there are so many regulations that one day he said to me over coffee, I just found this new law that actually matters. I didn't even know it was there because it was so buried in all of this underbrush. So cleaning out the underbrush makes a big difference and hopefully makes more companies being willing to join the industrial base because it's easier to get your head wrapped around.
In addition to the repeals, then, I'm imagining there's a bunch of clever tweaks to old language from previous NDAAs, which were perfectly written at the time, I assure you.
So one of the modifications would be there's a statute 10 USC 3703, right? And that is exceptions to the TINA statute that we've talked about, the certified cost and pricing. Currently, if you are at DoD or NASA, and only those agencies generally, if there is a competition, and so because of the competition, companies bid a certain way, so you get the benefit of competition, but it turns out...
Because it controls prices, it lets you see that robot jump this high, that robot jump that high, I picked that robot, right?
And the price, people are competing on price, so they know to try to go as low as they can, basically, and win the business. If it turns out only one person bid, you still have to go through the entire certified cost and pricing data. Now, that doesn't apply to civilian agencies. Civilian agencies don't have to do that. They say if there was competition, even if it turns out only one was won at the end of the day, you don't have to go through it.
And certified cost and pricing data is a completely foreign concept in the commercial world. And it sounds like it doesn't apply in the civilian world. It exists in the defense world because it's a way to protect the customer, so he knows you're not ripping them off.
Certified cost and pricing data can appear there, but you don't have to do it if you had competition, if only one company ends up being a qualified bidder.
Right, right. But I'm saying it exists to protect the customer. But why does everyone hate it so much?
Because it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and delays things a lot. Because you have to start certifying data and going back and getting updated prices. That takes effort and time and, frankly, cost. So if you want to speed up the process and if you want to improve the cost proposition, if you're getting the benefit of competition, just get the benefit of competition. That would be a change. Another change is increasing thresholds for other than competitive procedures. Right? So that also makes it faster.
So this is the idea that for low dollar amounts or in certain areas, we allow the government to go faster, not do formal paperwork, not do the formal competition processes, to buy things that are low dollar values, right? So these are things that we call the simplified acquisition threshold. We call it the micro purchase threshold. It's even when a Department of Defense employee uses our government credit card to buy something, right? So are we increasing the dollar limits that allow the sort of faster purchasing of those kinds of things?
So for a lot of them. So I'll tell you some of the thresholds that we're raising. So raising the threshold for simplified procedures for small purchases from $5 million to $10 million. We're raising the threshold for micro purchase, for simplified acquisition threshold, for other than competitive procedures, which is 10 USC 3204. But what is interesting in this NDAA in the House, this is all taking place in the House, this action of the thresholds, is that normally what you see in the NDAA is DoD specific language. This section, 1821, raising all of these thresholds, also includes mirror increases of thresholds for the civilian agencies. So this would imply a lot of close work together between the House Armed Services Committee and the House Oversight Committee. That's what would seem to be the case.
And it would benefit those companies that have to sell to multiple agencies.
Right. It's the same rules.
Right.
It only makes more sense.
Right, right. So the last one I want to focus on is House. I saw House Section 1824, which goes after something you talked about right at the beginning, this cost accounting standards. So what do they try to do with 1824?
Right. So we talked about how the cost accounting standards are unique accounting standards, and they generally have not been updated for decades. Now, accounting processes have. The typical accounting standards that you find in industry are GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. Some of those principles today cover issues that CAS is trying to get at, the cost accounting standards. So they're trying to get at a few things here. One of the things they're trying to get at is, hey, those principles that we could cover and get taxpayer protection in other ways, like using GAAP, let's stop using CAS for those provisions. Let's move to a GAAP plus, or in other words, go to GAAP and only add those things that you absolutely need to for purposes of visibility and protecting the taxpayer.
So now, who would this help? Would this help a commercial company that's never done business with the department because they've never gotten into cost accounting standards?
So it would probably mostly help those companies that would be interested in doing business on contracts that are cost contracts, where DoD wants to track the cost so they know where things are being spent.
So this will help more the traditional defense contractors who take on those kinds of research and development activities, the major defense programs that traditionally have those kinds of cost contracts.
I would not say that. I would say it actually helps the department expand the number of companies who are willing to do those contracts, because it is not cheap and it is not easy to implement a whole nother cost accounting system to try these other contracts.
Okay, so all we've been talking about, this going faster, this going commercial, this reducing the accounting standards, department getting less information about cost and price on what they're buying. Why is this of benefit to the taxpayer? Why is this of benefit to the warfighter?
So I'm going to disagree with how you asked the question. You said we're reducing the cost principles. No, we're saying if we get that information through it. So think of it like this. We have a stock market, the New York Stock Exchange, the Dow, right? All these companies on every one of the exchanges are auditable, right? They're auditable. You know who's not auditable? The Department of Defense is not auditable, right? There are good accounting principles out there that work, because if a company can't pass an audit, they get generally delisted, right? So if we have good accounting principles that DoD could use that are standard in the commercial sector, let's use those. Why are we doing these unique things that cost more and make it more difficult? That's what we're talking about. Or with some of the thresholds that we're increasing that haven't been increased for a while, like the CAS thresholds, at some point, does it make sense to spend $10 in oversight to save $2 on a contract?
So all these provisions, which sound a lot alike, you were mixing Senate and House provisions together. In general, the Department of Defense has been supportive of these things?
So it depends on which ones, right? Some things they definitely like, some things they don't like. Sometimes they don't like something and it happens anyhow, and then they're like, oh, this actually isn't a bad thing. We kind of like that. And vice versa, frankly, as well. Sometimes, a new thing seems like a better idea than it is.
Right. So the process by which we go from the House passed version, the Senate passed version into a thing we call conference, the Department of Defense will be the whole time these negotiations are going on. They'll also be part of that, telling the Congress what they want.
Yeah, so, and it even starts before that. So you can actually go onto the website at DoD, and they have, I believe it's at this point, 9 legislative packages that they have sent over to the Hill, to Congress, asking for some things, right? Some of them, frankly, are increasing the simplified acquisition threshold. Some of them are going to best value and not lowest price. So this goes back to why this could be an impactful NDAA, because some of the things Congress is seeking to do, like increasing real commercial buying, is very similar to executive orders that the president has signed seeking to increase real commercial buying. So there is synergy here.
And if industry wants to get engaged in this conversation and sees things they like or don't like, well, first of all, how do they find all of these things you've been talking about?
So listen to the podcast.
Okay.
You will hear a lot of things that we're talking about. So there are a lot of ways that it could happen, but really the easiest thing to do is to pull the bill, right? So you can go to congress.gov is the way I like to do it, but there are other sources as well. And you can find the House and Senate versions of the National Defense Authorization Act. There's also a lot of article reporting on it. The other way you could do is really reach out to trade associations. NDAA is a perfect example. The people here at NDAA are highly engaged and knowledgeable on the current state of the NDAs.
Yeah, and there's a policy and strategy group at NDAA that puts out weekly information on everything that's happening in Washington. Folks like Moshe put out information like that. And this is the time by which you can talk to your representatives, your senators, about what you see in these bills and give them some sense of how it's really going to affect your business and therefore their constituents. And then this is the time when they can then go to their Senate and House leadership and say, I'd like to see that Section 1809 tweaked in this way because it might affect my constituents in a way I don't like.
I would say not only this is the time that you can, this is the time that you must.
Right.
Because when they come back in September, they're going to be quite busy. So start thinking about it now and engage quickly.
All right. So Moshe Schwartz is the president of Atherton and Associates. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
But you're coming back. This is a 2-part episode, so make sure to tune into part 2 very soon. So Moshe, you're going to be back on another episode of Emerging Tech Horizons. That's great. All right, everyone. If you enjoyed this podcast, please don't forget to like our episodes and subscribe to stay up to date with all of our latest content. We're available on YouTube and anywhere you get your podcasts. A special thank you to Melanie Yu, Daniel Park, and Logan the intern for producing this podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in to Emerging Tech Horizons.